Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 8th annual Buntingford Shorts Student Short Film Festival. Last night we celebrated the very best in local filmmaking talent at our local showcase, but tonight our attention turns to the international stage. Tonight we are excited to showcase the winners of our 6 international categories: animation, comedy, documentary, drama, horror, and music for film, where we received over 1,600 entries from more than 120 countries all around the world. This is among some of the highest we've had since we started the festival back in 2017. So, it's shaping up to be a fantastic evening. The format of tonight's event is as follows. We will visit each of our categories in turn and introduce the 3 finalists in each category by showcasing a short trailer for each of the different films. Then we will hear from our panel of judges regarding their thoughts on each film before the overall category winner is announced. The winning film will then be shown in full for your enjoyment. Before we kick things off with our animation category, I'm delighted to welcome back not 1 or 2, but 5 Buntingford Shorts alumni as the judges for this year's International Awards. Without further ado, I'll leave them to introduce themselves.
Hello everyone, my name is Paulin Grenade and I am a French short film director based in Brussels. I have the honor of presenting the animation category at the Buntingford Shorts Festival, a festival that I took part 4 years ago with my graduation film.
Hi everyone, I am Monica Dhaka, a documentary filmmaker, and I am currently working for Universal Studios in their product category team. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of the Buntingford Short Film Festival once again, because this film festival actually holds a very special place in my heart, because my documentary film Belonging and the Scene won in the documentary category last year, and it's been such an incredible experience for me personally. And now being part of the 2025 judging panel is truly an honor, and I cannot wait to witness the creativity and the storytelling that this year's film bring to the screen.
Hi, I'm Eleonore. I come from France and I do not really speak English well, so sorry. I'm here because last year I won the Music for Film award, and it was for a short movie called Raphael. It was a movie about a young student composing a song during this movie. So I was really happy to win it.
Hey guys, my name is Lukas Weißer and I'm a student screenwriter at Film Academy Baden-Württemberg in Germany, and I'm very passionate about comedies. Last year we won the comedy category here with our film The Bosch, and I was very delighted to be given the confidence to be on the jury myself this year and to watch all the great films that made it to the finalists.
Hi, my name is Mark Trapani. I'm a documentary filmmaker focused primarily on the underrepresented stories of human nature and science. I believe the best documentaries come from listening, really listening to what your contributors have to say. And I once read that if you end up with the same story you thought out during pre-production, then you are likely not listening very well along the filmmaking process. I was introduced to this festival last year through my film Bumper, which won the documentary category. That film explored the topics of homelessness, mental health, and the effects canines can have on people going through these rough situations. I was also very happy to see that the film actually raised enough funds to take Justin off the streets, and it just goes to show the power of filmmaking in reality. It can make a difference in people's lives on a day-to-day basis. This year I'm very excited to be on the other end of the judging table, if you can say that. I'm very excited to see all the short films you have submitted and to learn about the stories which motivated you and actually inspired you to get out there and make a film. So well done on that. I really enjoyed watching that.
Tonight's first category is the animation category. This category covers many different styles of animation, from stop motion to CGI, and we've been really impressed by the range of styles, concepts and ideas that this year's filmmakers have shown. Tonight's animation nominees are Grindelberg's Case by Alexei Nouri, I'm Not a Robot by Gyeon Hee Eon, and Catastrophic by John Hegarty.
Depuis 2 semaines, tous les cinémas londoniens ont été pris pour cible par un vandale. Vitres brisées, sièges ravagés et j'en passe.
Seul. Il y a quelque chose qui cloche. Welcome to VCAPTCHA World.
So this is like a spot to block robots, right?
Exactly. Pass all the tests in 2 minutes and get a cookie sticker. Then, good luck.
Who am I? I'm not a robot. Sure thing, I'm the cursor. Sunny is probably looking for me.
Were you trying to get crazy in this scene? Don't you know I'm loco?
First of all, thank you to all the participants for this year. We loved the fluorescent depression of the character evolving in the post-apocalyptic world of Catastrophic. We were dazzled by the visual and rhythmic mastery of Grindelberg's case. And finally, we were bowled over by the originality and humor of I'm Not a Robot. It wasn't easy to choose. The 3 films were so creative and so different, so really we encourage all the directors to continue their work and to submit their creations again to festivals.
And the winner is Grindelberg's Case by Alexi Nuri. Congratulations, Alexi.
Hi, we are 2 members of the Grindelberg's Case team. There are 3 other members who aren't here tonight, unfortunately, but we are so happy to have won the Buntingford Shorts Festival, which takes place in the UK, which is very funny because our short film takes place in the UK too. We were very inspired by the City of London and Sherlock Holmes.
For Grindelberg's voice actor, we had the opportunity to work with the exceptional and very talented Sophie Riffon, and she is also the voice of Lin Beifong in The Legend of Korra. It was a great moment and we thank her for her work.
Thank you. Bye.
Arrêtez-vous! Satané d'eau! Enfin, Doyle, vous auriez pu vous dépêcher, il vient de nous échapper.
Je vais aller chercher mon...
Ne traînez pas, monsieur Doyle, je n'ai pas...
Wow, 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 wow.
Bon sang, c'était notre dernière piste!
Votre café.
Reprenons dans l'ordre. Depuis 2 semaines, tous les cinémas londoniens ont été pris pour cible par un vandale. Vitres brisées, sièges ravagés et j'en passe. Sans toucher à un seul centime des caisses. Le voleur ne s'en prend qu'aux bobines qu'il découpe et suctionne.
Ah, excusez-moi. Si je peux me permettre, comment pensez-vous qu'un criminel puisse réussir à vous échapper si facilement? Et s'il avait des alliés? Ou qu'il connaissait déjà les lieux? Oh! Imaginons qu'il...
Bon. Peut-être un cinéma concurrent qui venait voler du matériel. Non. Vu l'étendue des dégâts, un cinéphile aurait juste volé le matériel pour le réutiliser chez lui. Un jeune alors? Un voyou qui voulait s'amuser en détruisant un lieu public? Non, ça peut pas être ça, la caméra était intacte. Et comment un jeuneau pourrait savoir comment sortir la bovine pour la... Ah! Pour la découper.
En à peine quelques secondes, la nourriture avait disparu.
Pourriez-vous me décrire le suspect?
Tout s'est passé tellement vite. Je n'ai vu qu'une silhouette de...
Ah! Excusez-moi. Vous travaillez souvent sur ce genre d'affaires? Je veux dire, ce genre de délit un peu loufoque, c'est votre spécialité?
Loufoque?
Eh, attendez. Oh! C'est vous, ça?
Oui, après l'affaire du Cannon Street Railway Bridge en 1930. Pourquoi? On me reconnaît pas?
Non, je voulais pas dire ça.
C'était la bonne époque. Je m'en rappelle comme si c'était hier. Prenez-en de la graine, Doyle. Si vous devez attraper un criminel un jour, tendez bien votre bras et enclenchez d'un coup sec.
Wow, on dirait que votre dos va mieux. Vous avez entendu?
Entendu quoi?
Attendez, je rembobine. Non, il est seul.
Mais qu'est-ce que vous faites?
Seul. Il y a quelque chose qui cloche. Voilà, c'est ça. Attendez.
Des talons. C'est une femme.
Exact. Qu'est-ce que vous mijotez? Un grincement avec 4 pieds?
Un tabouret. Et donc...
Elle est donc petite. Très petite. De la même taille qu'un enfant. Non. Non, c'est absurde. À moins que...
C'est une grand-mère?
Bonjour, chers visiteurs. Un ticket pour quel film?
Greta Maverick, vous êtes en état d'arrestation. Veuillez me suivre sans faire d'histoire. Tout ce que vous direz pourra être...
policier? Je ne suis pas sûre d'en avoir. Oh, comme ça me fait plaisir de voir de nouveaux passionnés du cinéma. Du bon cinéma.
Madame Maverick, pourriez-vous nous suivre, s'il vous plaît?
Oh, ça suffit. Poussez-vous, monsieur Doyle.
Madame, vous vous rendez bien compte que ça ne marchera pas avec cette femme? Elle n'a plus toute sa tête.
Vous vous moquez de moi? Vous avez vu ce qu'elle a fait à tous ces cinémas? C'était un véritable chantier. Attention!
De pacotille! Vous n'aurez pas mon cinéma!
Mais c'est qu'elle a failli m'avoir, la vieille peau!
Madame, j'ai une idée pour l'attraper. Nous pourrions...
Restez ici et laissez-moi faire.
C'est Hollywood qui vous envoie, c'est ça? Vous ne m'aurez jamais vivante!
Doyle, qu'est-ce que vous pensez être en train de faire au juste? J'étais sur le point de l'attraper. Retournez en bas.
Elisabeth, vous êtes blessée. Et puis...
Faites très attention à ce que vous allez dire, Doyle. Vous devriez apprendre à rester à votre place. Vous ne prendrez pas les rênes de l'enquête tant que je serai debout.
Plus debout. C'est comme ça que vous faisiez à la bonne époque. La seule personne qui empêche cette affaire d'être bouclée, c'est vous. Pas elle, pas moi, pas votre dos, vous. Si vous m'aviez écouté, nous aurions fini depuis longtemps. Relevez-vous.
Vous ne m'aurez pas!
Le témoin Jacques Terry aurait entendu un claquement aux alentours de 20h. S'ensuivit un choc violent à l'arrière de son crâne. À son réveil, son appartement fut vidé. Le principal
Toujours
suspect-
sur votre gadget, n'est-ce pas?
Toujours aussi vieux jeu, n'est-ce pas?
Montrez-moi ce que vous avez là.
Tonight's second category is the comedy category, and as part of our shortlisting committee, it's been really enjoyable to see the range in humour used by students from all around the world. The nominations are Save Me White Jesus by Emma Connolly, The Elf Who's Making Your Toys is on £9 an Hour and Hates His Job by Matthew Vivian, and The Afterlife Show by Archie Bombonati, Daniel Pexto, Matthews Funari, and Rodrigo Torpakov.
Mom, how do you even know Jesus is real?
Christopher!
What?
Now for just $50 a bottle, you too can have this God-given miracle water. Hallelujah!
Damn it.
Don't tell me you haven't heard. Jesus is coming!
Well, I bet you I'm gonna be a big star. Might win an Oscar.
Every year, Santa's elves are tasked with deciding which children have been nice and which have been naughty.
Sorry, kid. Looks like it's going to be Lynx Africa for you.
This is a true story, right? One time I had to wrap a bike, but instead of 2 wheels, it had 3.
It's one of my core philosophies that children are very stupid.
Okay, that's time. Let's go!
1 minute to sleigh launch. 1 minute to sleigh launch.
São muitos os fenômenos que nos fazem acreditar no paranormal. E não se fala do paranormal sem citar a Mansão Magnólia, famosa por suas histórias horripilantes de fantasmas. Mas você já viu uma contada por um deles?
Oi, turminha! Meu nome é Hector Plasma. No meu programa, vocês vão presenciar, como nunca, a incrível experiência que é descansar nessa bela mansão.
Vixe, o cara do som morreu!
Bem? Então, morri, né? Não tô muito acostumado de ficar desse lado da câmera.
Nada mais justo que começar a recepção com um tour pela casa. Você vai adorar, rapaziada.
Ele só fica fingindo essas besteiras pra parecer que ainda tá vivo. E é melhor se acostumar.
Não precisa dizer mais nada. Pode deixar com a gente.
Só se acende as velas na hora da festa.
Você vai ficar aqui pra sempre.
Mas isso não importa.
So let's get on to the funny part of the evening. Here is the comedy category. The first nominee is The Afterlife Show. It is hilarious to die for. Rarely do you see a comedy with such much heart for details. The makers have fully understood how to break with expectations, and it's extremely entertaining. They delight us with a very special kind of house tour. The next one is The elf who's making your toys is on £9 an hour and hates his job. Yeah, this film would have definitely won the category of the longest title and tongue breaker. We all know how hard life is for Christmas elves, but finally a film team has found the courage to say so. The comedy is full of clever jokes and made me laugh out loud a few times, and honestly, when Christmas meets The Office, it's bound to be good. The last finalist is Save Me White Jesus, and rarely has a story in a church been as appealing to me as Save Me White Jesus. The animated film captivates with its very own charm and well-balanced humor. The quirky characters really breathe life into the spectacle. Really well done.
And the winner is The Afterlife Show by Archie Bombonati, Daniel Pexto, Matthews Finari and Rodrigo Torpakov. Congratulations, guys.
Hi everyone, my name is Arthur.
I'm Mateus.
I'm Rodrigo.
And I am Daniel Peixoto.
And we would like to thank you so much for this award in such an important category.
We never thought that doing silly jokes about dead people would take us so far.
But none of it would be possible without our beloved team of over 60 artists that helped us throughout the project.
And for the support for all our friends and family. Why do I have subtitles?
Thank you, Bunting for Shorts. Go Billy!
Go Billy!
Lobo!
Buggers.
Stairs.
Ventania, calafrios, vultos, Billy. Oi, Billy. São muitos os fenômenos que nos fazem acreditar no paranormal. E não se fala do paranormal sem citar a Mansão Magnólia. Famosa por suas histórias horripilantes de fantasmas. Mas você já viu uma contada por um deles?
Oi, turminha! Eu peguei vocês, né? Mas venham, sintam-se em casa! Meu nome é Hector Plasma, seu anfitrião e apresentador dessa inédita temporada, com cara e direção nova! Tudo graças a essa maravilhosa equipe de filmagem que aceitou vender suas lindinhas alminhas assinando o infame contrato. Assina aqui. Aqui também. No meu programa, vocês vão presenciar, como nunca, a incrível experiência que é descansar nessa bela mansão. Então preparem-se para uma rotina cheia de emoções tenebrosas, intrigas fantasmagóricas e até números de dança assombrados. E 1, 2, 3, 4... Vixe, o cara do som morreu! Bem, olhando pelo lado bom, pelo menos vamos apresentar a mansão para vocês e para um morador novo! Mas só depois do título!
Pode falar? Então, morri, né? Não tô muito acostumado de ficar desse lado da câmera, mas minha família deve estar bem feliz de me ver aqui. Né?
Tá bom. Sem enrolação. Nada mais justo que começar a recepção com um tour pela casa. Esse é o quarto das porcelanas quebradas. Esse é o quarto das porcelanas não quebradas.
Esse é o quarto de ensaio de Bu, quarto da boca, quarto da produção, incêndio, sauninha. E essa é a porta sinistra. Toda mansão assombrada tem que ter uma porta sinistra. Que é uma porta onde ninguém sabe o que tem do outro lado. Mas isso não importa. Porque vamos para a parte mais legal do tour, que são os residentes! Você vai adorar, rapaziada. Esses dois pombinhos são Boné Murcho e Nirvana. Mas vamos deixá-los a sós nesse joguinho caliente. E aquele figurão ali é o Sr. Esfíncter.
Por que ele tá encarando a gente?
Vai por mim. Ele não tá virado pra gente.
Como é que ele pode ser só uma bunda?
É que ninguém escolhe essa forma de fantasma. Mas essa aqui é a parte mais legal. Ali, ó, o Terce Carlos vive de ponta cabeça.
Meus olhos são de plástico.
Você veio bonitão.
Quê?
Já o Franz ali.
Opa.
Você acredita que ele era farmacêutico?
Então esse aqui acabou virando uma galinha.
Não. Esse aí era só uma galinha mesmo. Viu? Só uma galinha. Bem...
Isso acontece toda vez que a gente atravessa a parede.
Na maioria das vezes, mas... Você se acostuma. Mas enfim, amigão, eu tô meio apertado, então eu vou lá no banheiro dar uma esvaziada. Mas você pode ficar esperando aqui assistindo o programa favorito da casa. Adoro esse episódio.
A gente ainda precisa usar o banheiro?
Não.
Tá. Valeu, sofá. Pera.
Ele só fica fingindo essas besteiras pra parecer que ainda tá vivo. Vocês tinham que ver ele pagando os impostos de mentirinha dele.
Entendi. E aí, você morreu faz muito tempo?
Quê? Então você é novo aqui, não é?
Sim.
E tá gostando dessa esplêndida vida de morto, né? Que bom, porque é melhor se acostumar.
Como assim?
Vem cá. Tá vendo aquela assombração ali atrás?
Nossa, que medo.
Não tô falando disso. Esses dois aí estão até agora nessa mesma brincadeira estúpida.
Mas eles são crianças, né, fofo?
Eles são crianças já faz mais de 370 anos.
360...
70
anos.
Você vai ficar aqui pra sempre. Pra sempre. Pra sempre.
Guardanapos. 742 guardanapos. 743 guardanapos.
Pra sempre.
Pra sempre.
Foi o que eu disse. Tira esse fone pra ouvir os outros. Eu, hein?
Perfeito. E amém.
Qual é, Hector? Eu tava ocupado!
Robo-Samu, meu compadre! Eu tenho uma tarefa muito importante pra você.
Mas... que tipo de tarefa?
Eu quero que... organize uma festa surpresa!
Pera aí. Tá querendo me dizer que você quer que eu organize uma festa surpresa?
Isso mesmo! Uma festa surpresa!
Uma festa surpresa.
Uma festa surpresa!
Uma festa...
Surpresa! É pra receber um cara muito especial que...
Não precisa dizer mais nada. Pode deixar com a gente. Lasanha! Lasanha, meu bem! Alguém especial precisa de nós! Para a cozinha secreta! Eu sou o cara das festas! Quando o assunto é festa, todo mundo fala: ai meu Deus, cadê os canapés de camarão do Robossomo? E eu digo: calma, criancinha esfomeada, calma! Estão sempre comigo! Ah, lasanha! Pela última vez! Só se acende as velas na hora da festa!
Ai, ai, a feijuca fez um estrago. Ué, cadê o cara do som? Nefasto! Você não deixou mais um novato com crise existencial, deixou?
Ok, eu vou fugir daqui, voltar pra casa dos meus pais, comer escondidinho da mamãe porque é quinta e seguir minha vida normal. O quê? Como assim? Não é possível! Tem que ter outra saída!
Calma lá, amigão! Eu sei que você tá muito ansioso pra conhecer o resto da casa, mas deixa eu te mostrar uma coisinha primeiro. Aliás, já te contei sobre o meu livro? Tudo começou quando blá 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 blá. E é por isso que eu não uso calças.
Parabéns,
Parabéns!
Ele merece!
Uou! O que vocês estão fazendo? Por que o Billy?
Ué, você falou que a festa é para alguém muito especial. O Billy é um cara especial.
É verdade, mas não é o caso. Era pra fazer uma comemoração pra chegada do cara do som, pra enturmar ele na casa.
Você não grite comigo.
Ei, peraí! Eu nunca tive uma festa dessas!
Erra, nem eu! É por isso que precisamos de uma planilha!
Ei, fi, vai um canapé aí?
Ah, não, valeu, eu sou alérgico a camarão.
Você tá morto, imbecil!
Ah, verdade. Então, brigadão aí. Eu tô morto. Não gostei.
Esse é o fim de apenas mais uma noite comum na não-vida dessas pobres almas penadas. E vimos que nos lugares mais inesperados você pode ser amaldiçoado por eternos amigos. Mas, o que tornou essa casa mal assombrada? O que se esconde atrás da porta sinistra? Será que aquela galinha era realmente uma galinha?
Peraí, o episódio não acabou!
Esses e muitos mistérios ainda permanecem sem resposta na intrigante Mansão Magnólia. Acompanhe-nos nessa jornada para abrir sua mente...
Eu não tive nem tempo de fazer propaganda do meu livro!
E fazer a propaganda do livro... Seu filho da... Eu já tinha ensaiado todo o meu discurso de encerramento, pô.
Mas... Escuta aqui, voz misteriosa. O improviso também é uma ótima prática. Eu posso te ajudar.
Tá falando sério?
Começamos com um simples treino de voz. Olha o sapo dentro do saco. O sapo com... de novo. Olha o sapo dentro do saco. O saco com...
Eu não sou pago o suficiente para isso.
Batendo papo e o papo...
Yeah, Billy Tashiko.
Our third category this evening is the documentary category, and this is always one of the hardest categories to shortlist due to such a diverse range of topics covered, from the more sentimental to the more abstract, and on top of that, the many different ways in which the stories can be presented. Tonight's documentary nominees are She's Asking for It by Natalia Zajakovska, Win by Kyle Adams, and The 7A Ascent by Caleb Carter.
No, please, stop.
Good girl. I told you you'd love it.
Some of the best physical theatre drama on the planet.
It is poetry, it's an art form.
I'm Judah, I'm 15. I don't really like climbing under pressure. No! I'm such an idiot! I like the competition with myself to sort of push myself. To help push off. Yeah, that gave it everything then.
We've not done much of this type of climbing. We don't really know what grade Judah will climb outside.
So, trying to get around to the thought of being filmed, like the pressure of people watching me, expecting me to climb, but hopefully to get over those and have a good time. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Is that good?
So to start off with, in the documentary category, I'm going to be looking up just to make sure I get the names right. So the first film which I'd like to speak about is She's Asking for It by Natalia. It was a really strong film, very hard to watch at times, but I feel when the filmmaker can actually sort of perpetuate these feelings within the viewer, then the filmmaker is doing a good job. So in my opinion, this was a very hard-hitting film, but it's delivered very much so on a lot of different levels. The cinematography was really good, the emotions sent over to the viewer were different, and they make us all think of the society we live in. And ultimately, it's also really commendable what Natalia did. I really appreciate the fact that these stories are being put more out there, that we're challenging social norms, so well done on that. I really enjoyed your film. Second on my list, out of the three in this category, is The Ascent, the 7A Ascent, I think that's the full name. The name is, director is Caleb Carter. This was a really interesting film. It's more easygoing in a way, but still it had its there's that filmmaking sort of drama. Will he make it? Will he not? Like, he failed once, will he do it again? There was that kind of plot to it, which was nice to see. It was also really nice to see how young both the protagonist and the filmmaker are. Quite impressive that you're still 15, if I'm not mistaken. So that's impressive, like, well done on that, and well done on completing it. I'm sure we also need to acknowledge how difficult it is to film outdoors. Like, my background is wildlife, so I get to film outside a lot, and getting the right light, getting the right conditions, how wind can affect your sound, how certain things are just unpredictable because they're not in a studio. So kudos on getting a really good image and being able to do this. And the final film in this category was Win by, let me just get the name. They're not, 1 second. By Kyle Adams, sorry for the delay. This film in particular I really enjoyed as well. It changed my perspective of wrestling. Like, we've all come into contact or heard of wrestling and the WWE and all these kinds of big names. And we all, at least I thought that they're all these big men who are strong and they can do anything. And they're all these ultra masculine characters. So it was nice to see that sort of the other side of the equation, that wrestling and sports in general can be used as a medium for one to express himself in whatever manner he wants. It can either be in their sexuality and how they want to act, it's theater, drama, whatever. But it's nice to see a different form of avenue and to actually understand the story behind the performer in a way, which doesn't come across from these big wrestling shows that we see. So I believe this documentary also delivered, and it had a lot of character development. It made the viewer aware of why the characters do what they do. So that was really interesting to see, and I genuinely enjoyed it as well. It was, all three of them had very different trajectories along the film, but overall they were all equally enjoyable, I would say, and well done to everyone who worked on these films. They're really something to be proud of, so well done.
And the winner is She's Asking for It by Natalia Zajakovska. Congratulations, Natalia.
Hi, I'm Natalia and I'm the creator of She's Asking for It. It means so much to me to be receiving the Best Documentary Award for this film. The story means so much to me and my contributor and my team, and we are very grateful for the impact it has had so far, and I am only hoping it will now start a conversation around the topic.
And what if I don't want to?
Just give it a try.
You will learn to love it.
No, please, stop. No. No.
You'll learn to love it.
I think that people will be questioning if this is what actually happens. They might be like, your main title. She asked for that.
told you you'd love it.
But he pulled. But he pulled. But he pulled. And what if?
I told you you'd love it. Just nod. Look down. You're so pretty when you're sad.
Someone said once to me that I am beautiful when I cry. Like, sadness fits you. And I'm like, what? You look beautiful with sad eyes. What does it mean? It's like the beauty itself has more value than suffering. Remember when I told you about the guy that was curious about each other's bodies? This swan is like a symbol of curiosity of someone's body. And we can tell it's one-sided because she looks dead. I saw these pictures many times in school and we actually just ignored the part of the rape.
Hello, darling, you're right. Hey, can you hear me? I know you can hear me. Hey, what's your name? Wait, I'm fucking talking to you. Come on, have you got a phone number? Huh? Fucking bitch, I know you can fucking hear me. Turn around. Come on, you fucking cunt, just fucking talk to me. You fucking cunt, turn around!
She's asking for a dress like that.
Ah, excuse me. I'm going out tonight and I want to get assaulted. I need a dress that will encourage a guy to have sex with me against my will. Please, no, drug me, take me, force me, have me, please. I'm begging.
What will happen? What would change if I call the police or something? They will be just asking me questions like, did you scream? Did you fight back? It will be always just my fault in general. And that's actually crazy, because we are not supposed to feel these feelings, because it's not mine, it's not my responsible, it's not my feeling, it's not my emotions. That's your fault, it's not my fault, that's your embarrassment, not mine. So why am I doing this to me? Why am I like feeling this? You should be feeling this. You should be dealing with this for the rest of your days. I felt like my inner child was screaming from the top of my lungs. Like I said goodbye to a part of me. This traumatized part of me. Are you crying? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I I feel so sorry for that girl. I was. She deserved better. It doesn't have to be changing the whole perspective, the world's perspective, because it will not be. But you can change the world around you, starting from your friends, family, and you changed my world for sure. And I think that I will change my mother's, my sister's, my best friends, even brothers' world. So to me, that's the point.
We're now halfway through tonight's categories, and I'm sure you can agree that the quality has been outstanding. But before we showcase our final 3 winners, we'd like to pause for a moment to thank our sponsors, some of whom have supported us loyally right from the start 8 years ago. Tonight's incredible team of local sponsors include Buntingford Film Club, Evolving Spaces, Content by Gem, HD Print, and Yellow Technology. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you to all of these amazing local businesses. Without them, we genuinely wouldn't be able to put on the events that we have over the course of this weekend and have done previously. Moving swiftly on, we have our 4th category, the drama category. This is one of our broadest categories, but a consistent element that we look out for is the narrative, and tonight's finalists all have a unique story to tell. The nominations are An Olympic Dream by Rebecca Antunes, Molecomb Core by Carl Axel Edward, and Butterfly by Caleb Woods.
J'ai l'impression que je peux faire plus, en fait ça me rend ouf.
Tu sais que tu dis ça à chaque fois, et après t'assures.
Jag tog med mig kubb.
Seriöst?
Vadå?
Det är fan inte Molecomb Core direkt.
Vad betyder det?
Ja, men Molecomb Core, när vi är vid Molecomb-sjön så är det Molecomb Core precis som alltid.
Har du några planer?
Jag ska skicka bombhot till ditt nya kontor. Alltså för några år sedan så hade du fan försökt tackla ett träd eller vad?
Jo, det gjorde ont. Men David, kan du för fan bara sluta?
Vad är det som är så jävla svårt med att bara sitta still och vara dumma i huvudet? Bara nöja sig med det.
You told me to protect the butterfly. You told me not to kill it. You said it would be hard, but not to do it. The butterfly is dead.
I noticed the blood.
No. No, this is your fault!
So it's an honor for me to be judging this year's film, and I am really excited to share my thoughts on the finalist for this year's drama category. So, starting with The Butterfly, I think it is a very touching film that gives us a deeper, look into the mind of college students struggling with self harm. And I think it's a powerful and honest portrayal of a real challenge and addiction and mental health. I think personally, this film was very emotional for me as I have a friend that is dealing with similar struggles, and I absolutely loved how, it's handled. This film has handled this topic with so much of care. Our second finalist film is An Olympic Dream that stood out for me for its inspiring portrayal and perseverance. It's beautifully shown, the dedication and the passion, how it can push someone to chase their dreams against all odds. And I think it's a story that truly resonates, and it reminds us of the sacrifices and the determination behind every great achievement. So I enjoyed every bit watching this film. And our final finalist is the Malcolm Core. So what I really liked about this film is that how real and relatable it felt. The film perfectly captures the awkward spaces between holding on to the past and also realizing that we have to move on and life keeps going forward. I think visually it's very stunning, and beyond that, I think it really hits hard emotionally and also makes us as an audience think a bit. So I loved watching all the films in all the categories, and I hope you guys enjoy the drama categories as much as I did. And wishing all the three finalists in the drama category a very, very best of luck for tonight. Thank you so much for watching.
And the winner is Malcolm Core by Carl Axel Edward. Congratulations.
Hello. My name's Carl Axel Edward, writer and director of Malcolm Core, which was shot right here almost a year ago by now. And if you're seeing this, that means that we have won Best Drama over at Buddingford Shorts, in which I would like to thank my lovely crew, actors, anyone who supported our film in any way, and of course the organizers and jury over in Buddingford. Thank you very much.
Hey there, Mr. Money.
Om du säger fel.
Hey there, Mr. Money.
Fryser du? Behöver du en filt?
Du kunde inte väntat med att flytta till Stockholm förrän typ juni.
Wow, gnällig.
Ja, ful och dum i huvudet.
Ja, du som sa att du ville göra det här. Kurt sa att det var okej att ta det hos honom. Sa ni något?
Käft, Kurt! Först och främst helig boys-kväll, det vill säga ingen Annie.
Det är lagt.
Plus det ska vara en redig sista sup, så det ska göras här.
Visst väl att du var lite sentimental.
Du kan vara sentimental, kärring.
Ska inte sätta upp tältet först?
Nej, jag tog inte med något.
Ser det här bra ut?
Käft Kurt!
Ja, det ser bra ut. Vart ska du sova då?
Nej, jag tänker inte sova.
Det ser ju stabilt ut, men jag är inte
Men
säker.
för i helvete Kurt, får komma hit om du ska prata. Det är genuint sjukt att han ska bli pappa.
Jag vet inte. Han verkar ta det rätt lugnt.
Det är det som oroar mig.
Jag tog med mig kubb.
Seriöst?
Vadå?
Det är fan inte Molkom Core direkt.
Vad betyder det?
Ja, men Molkom Core, när vi är vid Molkomsjön så är det Molkom Core precis som alltid.
Ja, fulla högljudda, dumma i huvudet.
Ja, men inte bara det. Det är liksom hela viben.
Kan man göra med om man spelar kubb?
Ja, fan okej. Men i så fall så vill jag lägga till lite regler. Drick.
I mitt land kallas jag Mongo Andersson.
Vad var det jag sa? Han älskade ju.
Har du några planer?
För vadå? Sommaren?
Framöver, överlag.
Jag ska skicka bombhot till ditt nya kontor.
Såklart. Men utöver det då?
Nej, men det gamla vanliga. Lite online-kasinon, trädgårdsskötsel, skamma moderatpedofiler i den ordningen.
Du, på tal om trädgård. Annie och jag har snackat om att skaffa ett ställe med yttergård. Till när ungen har växt lite. Vi kan säkert hitta något hyfsat i Munkfors. Ja, men nu letar vi ju inte direkt.
Fortfarande din tur.
Just det. Ja, men seriöst, har du några planer?
Jag vet inte, fortsätta fixa datorer eller något.
Skulle du kunna starta en verkstad?
Ja, eller hur jävla sorgligt hade inte det sett ut?
Nej, jämfört med vadå? Ditt sovrum?
Aha. Drick.
Vi kan inte skippa den biten, tror du?
Nu är det live på Bolibompa, eller säg det bara.
I mitt land kallas jag för Homo Karlsson. Vad gör du för något?
Den skiten åker rakt ut på storyn.
Nej, David, det gör den fan inte.
Ja, för sent redan gjort.
Nej, David, ta bort den. Du, jag kan fan få sparken för den här skiten.
Men det är lugnt, ingen kommer se det.
Det är ett high-tech-företag. Alltså, de är helt sjuka i huvudet.
Men det är inte mitt fel att jobba för fascister.
Men David, kan du för fan bara sluta?
Ja, fan, lugna ner dig. För fan.
Är du säker på att du inte ska köra en runda? Okej, vad gör vi för något?
Vi ska testa Kurts pappastyrka.
Säker Kurt, du måste inte.
Ja, nej, det är lugnt.
Du sa att du hade ont i ryggen typ igår.
Han är för fan inte 80 eller?
Jag tror faktiskt det är lugnt nu.
Ja, okej. Johan, redo med klockan. 1, 2, 3 och...
Jävlar!
Käft Kurt, gör din pappa blikt.
Nej, fan David, han har ju ont.
Om du ramlar så kommer vi skicka den unge till socialen.
Fan! Min rygg. Är det okej, Kurt? Ja, tänker bara ligga lite.
Jag är ledsen Kurt, din unge tillhör nu Karlstad kommun.
Örebro kommun.
Va?
Örebro! Varför skulle de skicka din unge till Örebro? För att vi ska flytta dit.
Ska ni flytta till Örebro? När fan då?
Om en månad typ. Och det säger du nu? Jag sa det till er på krogen för typ 3 månader sedan. Nej, det gjorde du inte. Jo. Men varför kommer ingen av oss ihåg det då? Ja, vi var väl för fulla. Eller så sa David käft.
Varför ska ni flytta?
Enligt Annie finns det några bra jobbtillfällen för oss båda där. Lite dyrare antar jag, men Annie säger att det är lite trevligare där. Överlag.
För att det inte skulle gå igenom så kan ni höra företaget jag ska till utökas en avdelning i datorteknik.
Ja, Annie farsa har ett par kontakter i Örebro. Mest industri, men bättre lön. Kanske. Jag är glad så länge man kan få till något stabilt.
David?
Ja?
Jag tänkte, eftersom det inte verkar som du har några planer.
Ja, visst.
Jo, absolut. Men ifall att det inte skulle gå igenom så fick jag nyss höra att företaget jag ska till utökar sin avdelning i datateknik.
Johan, du vet att jag inte vill...
Nej, men lyssna. Med din examen, dina betyg, med din generella kunskap så kan jag säkert åtminstone fixa en praktikplats åt dig där. I allt förutom arbetserfarenhet så är du säkert mer kvalificerad än vad jag är.
Jag har redan gjort praktik på sånt ställe, det sög.
Jo, men de är inte alla likadana.
Jo, Johan, det är de. Det spelar ingen roll hur mycket de snackar om innovation eller kreativitet. Det handlar bara om varumärke och intäkter. Jävla gamar i knasiga skjortor och fula jävla glasögon. Vad?
Jag frågar för att jag vill ha med dig dit.
Tack.
Jag tog med mig kort också. Helvetes jävla skit. Sorry, jag måste fixa det.
Hur många öl har du druckit egentligen?
Vet inte. 8 eller 9, typ.
Alltså för några år sedan så hade du fan försökt tackla ett träd vid det laget.
Jo, det gjorde ont.
Alltså jag säger inte att du borde göra det, men varför slutade du?
Jag skulle inte säga att jag slutade. Kom väl bara inte på att göra sånt längre.
Minns du när du spottade tändvätska över en öppen eld?
För nästan det är något fysiskt. Efter ett visst antal öl så blev jag bara typ trött.
Nej, du gör bara inte rätt. Kom så gör vi något.
Ja, visst, vadå?
Vad som helst.
Kan jag hämta kortleken?
Nej, för fan. Jag menar något redigt. Något Molkom Core, för fan.
Jag fattar inte vad du menar. Tjena.
Hej.
Du visste att mitt tåg imorgon har blivit inställt så jag måste ta sista tåget i natt om jag ska hinna till Stockholm i tid.
Jaså?
Ja, alltså jag bara kort ringa Annie. Hon hämtar oss ute vid vägen så får vi säga hej då vid stationen sen. Men ja, vi borde börja packa ganska snart.
Okej.
Vad tittar du på?
Jag vet inte.
Bara märkt att du har tittat ut hit typ hela kvällen.
Jag vet faktiskt inte. Vad är det som är så jävla svårt med att bara sitta still och vara dumma i huvudet? Bara nöja sig med det.
Ja, jag tror inte det räcker. Du vet, mitt erbjudande står fortfarande kvar. Kan bo hos mig så länge du behöver. Kan känna in praktiken lite. Och ja, skulle det inte vara något för dig så finns det inget som håller dig kvar.
Nej. Jag tror att jag stannar lite till.
Men det blir ju mörkt snart, du kan inte bara lämna det här.
Nej, men det är lugnt. Brorsan hämtar mig sen.
Mår du bra?
Ja, fan. Tänkte bara att ifall vi ska ha vårt gulliga lilla avslut så kan vi lika gärna göra det på ett ställe som inte luktar piss.
Jag visste väl att det var lite sentimental.
Kanske det.
Right. Kurt!
Va?
Kom hit för fan!
Ja.
Hej då David.
Hej då Kurt.
Hej då.
Hej.
Sent på natten när allt vatten dunstat och försvunnit från mitt golv. Du har flytvästen på land. Och ett hjärta i din hand. Och det flyter förmodligen inte. Men flyter du så slår det nog jag på mitt golv. Och jag betraktar dem på håll. Men doften fyller med färger som jag aldrig sett förut. Nej, aldrig förut. Sen blev allt gult och jag såg ut.
The penultimate category this evening is the horror category, and this is always one of the most enjoyable categories to watch because the directors always have a unique way of creating a sense of tension. Tonight's nominations are Mimics by Philippe Peter and Bruno Pires, Iris by Michael Keplinger, and Melrose by Barrett Loads.
let's get started with the horror category. The first finalist is Mimics. It serves us with great images and a thrilling story in the Brazilian jungle. You rarely see such a setting in the horror genre, and after this film you honestly ask yourself, why don't we? Great colors and vivid images support the chase through the thicket. The makers have an impressively ability to cast a spell over us. Really well done. The next one is Iris. Iris uses narrative means to draw us into the nerve-wracking story. It plays excellently with suspense and uncertainty. We know that we are being watched, but not who is out there or what the person wants from us. An absolutely thrilling film. The last finalist is Melrose. Melrose is a horror story at its best. The film is based on a true story and draws us right into the action with its impressive images. The makers succeed in evoking a great sense of unease in us and manage to convey the eerie atmosphere.
And the winner is Iris by Michael Keplinger. Congrats, Michael. Tonight's final category is the Music for Film category. This category focuses on the use of music and soundscapes and the way that they support the storyline of each film. The nominations are Identity by Daniel Kolotov, Whore by Robert Manassian, and Nothing by Sophia Munster.
Ich bin übrigens Lynn.
Niki. Nimmst du mich ein Stück mit? Wer ist das?
Das ist mein Vater.
Wenn etwas nicht mehr existiert, hat es keine Bedeutung mehr.
There's nothing for you, nothing for only the darkest fear of life.
Bedeutung bringen nur Schmerz.
Niki.
Hi, it's for the Music for Film competition. So thanks a lot for all of you because it was hard to decide. We watched 3 different movies, very different and impactful and interesting for different reasons. So I wrote different reasons so I could read them because I do not really speak English well. So about Nothing, the musical diversity reflects the complexity of the emotions experienced by the characters. The round trips of music in off and then in diegetics are very interesting and well used. The musical choices are strong and impactful. Then for Identity, the title reflects the function of the music in this movie. The musical and sound identity is unique and strong. It gives a real identity to the work. The use of materials in both pictures and music is very interesting, and the sound design is also complete and effective. And then for the last one, I don't know how to say the title, so I prefer not to say it, sorry. At first, the music is more contemplative and it immerses the viewer directly into the world of the movie. It helps to travel with the young boy. Then, the music supports the issues and reinforces the experiences lived by the protagonist. The composition and sound design strengthens the soft, touching and gripping side of the works. So thanks a lot to everybody for this movie, and I hope you create others and other musics. Bye!
And the winner is Identity by Daniel Kolotov. Congrats, Daniel.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Даниил Колотов, я режиссер фильма «Идентичность», и я безмерно благодарен вашей награде, потому что мы всегда с командой, когда делаем кино, мы убеждены, что 50% фильма вообще – это музыка и звук. И как мы благодарны, что вы оценили именно эту часть, которую многие почему-то считают не такой важной, а делают акцент только на визуал. Всю музыку написал композитор Илья Нефедев, в записи участвовали молодые джазовые музыканты из Санкт-Петербурга. Кстати, одним из рабочих названий фильма было «Heart of Jazz», потому что джаз – это музыка души. Спасибо.
So that's it for another year. You've now seen all 6 international winners, and it's been an absolutely brilliant night of student short film. But before we go, we'd like to say a few final thank yous. Firstly, thank you to all of the young filmmakers around the world that submitted to us this year. Without the films, we would have no festival. Linked to that, a huge thank you to the committee, Paul Hutton, Jill Alderton, Ollie Wilson, Suz Keith and myself, Jake Andrews, along with our additional volunteer Mike Huskin, for watching and reviewing all 200 hours of film that we received this year. It's a massive job, but one that's incredibly enjoyable, and hopefully you've enjoyed the final results of our labour. And finally, a big thank you to you, our audience, for tuning in. It's been a brilliant year, and we can't wait to see you again in 2026. Good night.